I have come into your lives this evening like a comet out of nowhere. I have not spoken before on harm reduction, nor is my area of research in nicotine. I am here because of the essay I wrote for the American Interest, an opinion magazine on public health and vaping. That essay was a mild defense of vaping, but a pointed criticism of today's public health establishment, at least in the United States. And because of the interest in that essay, I find myself here. And so I thought I would spend the time this evening broadening the scope of what I wrote in that essay and discussing in more detail my thinking behind it. I'd like to begin with a story from my own anesthesia practice. Several years ago, I sedated a very obese man for surgery. Another anesthesiologist came into the room, made jokes about the man's weight, and laughed out loud. When I told my colleague that the man was only half asleep, he grew worried. He feared the man might sue him if he remembered the insult after waking up. And so he asked me to give the man a drug called Versed, which causes amnesia. When I reminded him that the drug causes people to forget things going forward, but not things already said, my colleague bowed his head and left the room, thinking he'd already lost half his fortune in court. Fortunately, the man did not remember anything after waking up, and my colleague was safe. I tell this story to identify a trend in anesthesiology since its beginnings in the 19th century. Over the years, my specialty has divided the targets of anesthesia into pain, awareness, amnesia, and consciousness. In the past, anesthetic gases such as ether hit all these components almost by scattershot. But over time, specific drugs came onto market to target select feelings and experiences, with a drug like Versed, for example, targeting memory. This is just a microcosm of what happened in the larger society over the last 2 centuries. In the past, when people wanted to numb themselves to life's problems, they used alcohol, analogous to the way the anesthesiologists use ether. Alcohol numbed people's minds and gave them relief from all kinds of life problems, again, almost by scattershot. But over time, drug companies eyed the various unpleasant feelings in life that prodded people to drink and divided them into categories, for example, into anxiety, depression, insomnia, and pain, and then, as in anesthesiology, targeted them with specific agents. Those agents were then subdivided and made even more precise. So, for example, the drug Versed, which I use in the operating room, is one of 60 drugs that make up the class of Valium-like drugs called benzodiazepines, which are used to treat insomnia and anxiety. When treating insomnia, each benzodiazepine has its own special trick. One form gets people off to sleep immediately, another form kicks in after 4 hours to prevent early morning wake-up, and so on. An analogous trend occurred in the tobacco world. Centuries ago, when one wanted a lift in mood, or a feeling of calm elation, or a little extra stimulation to focus better, one would smoke tobacco or perhaps drink coffee. As in the case of ether and alcohol, nothing else is available. But over time, entrepreneurs discovered ways to target the desired sensations more precisely and with fewer side effects. In the case of coffee, caffeine pills are invented. And in the case of tobacco, electronic cigarettes, or e-cigarettes, are invented. Now, whenever a new product comes into market, it makes already established companies nervous. In the case of e-cigarettes, the tobacco companies and the drug companies that manufacture tobacco substitutes feared they would lose market share, and at first they campaigned against the new product. This is how interest groups usually operate. They defend their turf, they dislike change, they expand incrementally, and they operate for the direct and immediate benefit of their members. Many public health experts also fought against e-cigarettes. They still do. But unlike the tobacco companies or drug companies, they do not do so for profit. They are not worried about market share. They do so for reasons of ideology, I realize. They do so for the sake of a larger political vision. And this realization is what gave me the idea for the essay. What is ideology? An ideology is a belief system adopted by a large number of people over a long period of time, one with an element of hope and aspiration in it. Its goal is to improve people's quality of life somehow. So, for example, through more physical security, more material benefits, more happiness, more peace. A single catchword usually sums it up. The catchword may have once been any old word, but associated with an ideology, the word brings to mind an entire worldview when heard. For example, the word diversity has been in the English language for centuries, and during all that time, it meant nothing more than its definition. Now, when the word is uttered, everyone knows what it means. It immediately conveys an entire worldview about how society should be organized. Same with the word green. The color has been around forever, But now when the word is spoken, it communicates a whole body of doctrine about how we should live our lives in relation to nature. Ideology has cropped up within the field of mental health. For example, the word neurotransmitters refers to all the little molecules that enable nerves to communicate with one another. But over the last 30 years, the word has achieved popular resonance. It means much more when spoken. When a layperson nowadays tries to explain his or her unhappiness and invokes the word neurotransmitters to do so, the listener immediately knows what it means. The word expresses in capsule form the new belief that unhappiness, as opposed to true clinical depression, is a medical problem more than a life situational problem, and something best treated with drugs. Something similar happened with the phrase public health. The phrase has been around for centuries, but over the last few decades, it no longer just describes a field. The word public has become synonymous with the word community, which has become a catchword in its own right. It reflects people's fear of isolation and longing for a world where people come together, a feeling exacerbated by their increased loneliness. In the US, skilled politicians sense and take advantage of this fear, and so they often use catchphrases such as, "We need to go back to community," or "Let's build more communities." For similar reasons, whenever pushing a healthcare plan, whether liberal or conservative, American politicians will typically support public health in their plan, because they know the word public is linked in voters' minds with the utopian ideal of community. When voters say, "I really believe in public health," what they are saying is that they dislike the medical industrial complex, which to their minds is all about doctors and drug companies making money for themselves rather than putting people first. Not surprisingly, the word community often appears in public health publications, while many departments of public health have subdepartments of community health. When joined to the word public, the word health has its own wider meaning now. Rather than signify just the health of the body, it refers to the health of the body politic, of the community, in all aspects, for example, in matters of justice, equality, and social welfare. Hence, public health's expansion well beyond its original portfolio of infectious disease. But because of public health's link to medical science, public health represents the worldview that is through science and the scientific method, rather than through philosophy or politics, that such problems can be solved. A whole host of derivative ideas now surface when the phrase public health is uttered. Mental health has become a big part of public health, causing public health to absorb the ideology signified by the word neurotransmitters. Other words, such as wellness, lifestyle, and prevention, are also linked to public health and have become ideological catchwords in their own right. They are well known to anyone who has observed the American cultural scene over the last few decades. In the past, the word prevention meant sanitation and quarantines. Today, for many people, it is sloganistic shorthand for the right of a layperson to become more involved in his or her health and happiness, to take action before getting ill, and not to blindly take orders from a doctor, or to wait for the medical industrial complex to take control of his or her body. This outlook is laced with a strong distrust of authority. Indeed, there's something rebellious, even revolutionary, in its hostility toward establishment medicine. The word wellness is equally inspirational in a mental health way. When a layperson says, "I'm really into public health and wellness," the person is communicating the desire to live healthier, longer, and better, without the stresses of modern life. It is associated with the word lifestyle, as in healthy lifestyle, which, when uttered, means living for personal happiness independent of how the world might judge them. An example of this in everyday conversation might be when a man refuses to take a job because, in his words, lifestyle is more important to me. Public health today is home to a wide variety of ideological currents and worldviews that touch on people's hopes and fears. Some of these currents affect politics. I will focus more on how they affect harm reduction and in a negative way. But it's important to understand that public health is no longer just another medical field. It has managed to tap into people's consciousness about what it means to live a good life on many levels. Public health and the word ideas associated with it symbolize a larger and more complex outlook, one that appeals to people's interests, but also to their anxieties about the world around them and their place in it. That public health has turned to a realm of ideology is perhaps best illustrated in the way it has turned science itself into ideology. Let me give an example. Years ago, I attended a social science conference where a public health professor talked about her research. She had visited hospitals and observed several cesarean sections being performed. She noted that the operating table was always tilted to the left during these surgeries, causing the patient's blood to spill onto the nurse's shoes rather than onto the doctor's. She called this sexist and said things need to change. I raised my hand to say she was mistaken. The professor doubled down and said she had seen this with her own eyes. I replied I was an anesthesiologist with a specialty in obstetrical anesthesia. This obviously came as a surprise to her given the venue. I went on to explain that all C-section patients are tilted to the left because the pregnant uterus compresses the vena cava, which returns blood to the heart and lies slightly to the right of the spinal cord. Because most C-sections are done under spinal anesthesia, which drops blood pressure, the additional drop in blood pressure caused by a compressed vena cava risks dropping blood pressure even more. The leftward tilt prevents this. Now, since most surgeons are right-handed, and therefore must deliver a baby while staying on the patient's right side, and at the time, most surgeons were men, and since the nurse must therefore stay on the patient's left side to assist, and at the time, most nurses were women, what appears to be sexism is actually the consequence of anatomy and physiology. I told the professor her policy recommendation would kill thousands of women. The public health professor had confidence in her conclusion because she had used a scientific method. She had formulated a hypothesis, tested it through experiment, and then analyzed the result to verify her hypothesis. But the scientific method fails in this kind of situation. To push the method blindly as she had is not science, but ideology. As public health grows more ideological, this has become a problem. In the 17th century, while studying the positions of the planets, Sir Isaac Newton used the scientific method to discover the laws of motion. The method remains the basis for all scientific inquiry, but it has defects. First, the method is one of intentional ignorance. It demands that investigators focus on certain chosen details, isolate them, and leave out all the rest. This means investigators reach conclusions by looking at only a small portion of the facts. Second, in isolating such details, and supposing such isolation to be accurate, investigators suppose what is false. Third, the scientific method encourages investigators to transcend individual details and to substitute generalizations that are convenient for thought, but which are nothing more than phantoms. The phantoms are then confused with real existence. These limitations explain why the scientific revolution began in astronomy. The scientific method works best when applied to an area we know little about. In astronomy, we make extremely limited observations about stars and other planets. We can talk about them only in the simplest terms. Our ignorance lets us believe we have found the ideal science. For similar reasons, physics and chemistry are the next most perfect sciences. Their scales are so tiny that we can't see most of the details, only general effects here and there. In their experiments, physicists and chemists single out certain observable changes as the main phenomena, when in fact a lot more is involved. The closer we get to our subject and the more we know, however, the more the scientific method breaks down. An astronomer can feel comfortable calling a faraway star's path a line, even though it may curve out there at the edge of the universe. The astronomer can assume the scientific method has revealed the truth, and it will likely never be disproven. But human behavior is a level on which many investigators today work. And unlike faraway stars, human behavior is something we know a lot about. For every one observation made about stars, poets and philosophers have made millions about people's habits, behaviors, and feelings. All people, trained and untrained, are familiar with life. This is why the scientific method works so poorly on the level of life. Compared to astronomy, we see so much more. We know so many more details, and therefore we can watch the scientific method go wrong. Newton warned others not to take the method too far, not to turn it into ideology, and his advice was heeded for a time. But as the allure of science and the authority of science grew, many fields of study embraced the method. For example, psychology, economics, political science, public policy, and yes, public health. Practitioners in these fields knew the facts of life were vast and variable from person to person, but rather than satisfy themselves with groping for life's answers through the veil of that reality, they used the scientific method to wander outward, seeking something definite and universal in abstraction. They carved up people into categories and subcategories, thinking that through fragmentation, they would find some deeper truths about life. Public health experts were more prone to doing this than doctors were. Doctors create categories and abstractions too, but they also deal with individual patients, and so they find it hard to disregard the human and the personal. Public health, on the other hand, deals with entire populations. Therefore, the urge to generalize and form universal concepts is greater in public health. The tendency to oversimplify and turn the scientific method into ideology is greater. Here are just a couple of examples of the scientific method stretched to study the problem of vaping in teenagers, leading to sweeping generalizations. One public health study surveyed 7,000 smaller studies that in turn had surveyed tens of thousands of teenagers to see if vaping led to cigarette smoking. The smaller studies grouped teenagers according to a number of risk factors, such as low self-esteem, depressive behavior, anxiety, and rebelliousness. The authors of the larger study then picked 9 of these smaller studies based on the, quote, comparability of the psychopathology, end quote, surveyed in each study. They concluded from their big analysis of their much smaller analyses that vaping among teenagers led to a higher chance of smoking within 2 years. And for this reason, they recommended tighter restrictions on vaping. Here was their arrogance. The investigators in the smaller studies bundled together certain human attributes and gave them names. For example, anxiety and depression. Now, real people have thousands and thousands of attributes, but the investigators limited the number of attributes so they could form general concepts, the concepts of anxiety and depression. The investigators in the larger study then created a concept out of these concepts, the, quote, comparability of the psychopathology, thereby broadening the generalization while sacrificing more depth. The process is not unreasonable. Well-defined categories make information easier to comprehend and easier to apply to new cases, and is a basic principle of the scientific method that the fewer the variables, the cleaner the result. But in their quest for universal concepts, the investigators risked abandoning the real article and taking up with a shadow. That is, taking a concept drawn from concepts, which are themselves drawn from a handful of human attributes, declaring that one concept to sufficiently represent reality, and then using that concept to formulate a policy governing the lives of people with thousands and thousands of attributes. A second public health study observed that the same exhalation techniques used to produce smoke rings with traditional cigarettes can be used to make rings of aerosol with e-cigarettes. For this reason, the study concluded teenagers may acquire cigarette smoking behavior through the use of e-cigarettes, and that this makes the transition to cigarette smoking more natural. The investigators parlayed this point into recommending tighter restrictions on vaping. Here was their arrogance. The investigators stripped off all attributes they thought they saw in one teenager and not another, until they found an attribute, namely the ability to exhale, which was common to all teenagers. Now, one relevant form of exhalation is aerosol rings. And since such rings might or might not be made with each exhalation, the ability to exhale and the potential to make aerosol rings became paired attributes that the investigators found useful to class teenagers by, not because they represented the various teenagers very well, but because they were found in all teenagers. It's like classifying people by their shoes, not because shoes are a valuable method of classification, but simply because everyone wears shoes of one kind or another. Having thought away all the other qualities of teenagers except the 2 attributes of exhalation and the potential to make aerosol rings, the investigators tried to explain the transition to cigarettes by these 2 classifying concepts that were left. They credited these 2 classifying concepts, exhalation and aerosol rings, with an independent existence and proceeded to derive from them an understanding of why teenagers progress to smoking. In each of these cases, the authors used a scientific method to create a purely intellectual representation of teenage life. In the process, they emptied reality of meaning and turned it into pure generalization, leading them to the edge of sense and nonsense. In fact, common sense is the more meaningful guide here. Who here has watched teenagers, or at least been a teenager? All of us. I noted in my essay that a certain percentage of teenagers will partake in vice no matter what. They've been doing so for thousands of years. Is not vaping the safer vice? And if teenagers smoke less today because of public health education and not because of vaping, then why did the rate of teenage smoking remain roughly the same in the US from 2003 to 2013? Was not public health education just as aggressive then? And is it not plausible, when I think about my own teenage daughter and her friends, that starting in 2013, cell phones and social media became ubiquitous among teens who could not hold a phone and instant message each other for 2 hours, for 3 hours, without 2 hands, which made holding a cigarette impossible, and that this, rather than public health education, led to the drop in smoking? The variables to be considered on this issue are as infinite as the moods of a teenager, rendering the scientific method almost useless here. Public health's insistence that the method is definitive is arrogant and ideological. I want to spend the last 10 minutes talking about ideology and public health for a different purpose. to account for public health's hostility toward vaping. Several years ago, I went to an outdoor party. A man I knew walked off to the side, looking a bit down. I saw him light up a cigarette, and I went over to say hi. He was in a peculiar mood, and he began to open up. He said he had thought he accomplished very little in life. From an outsider's view, it might not appear that way, he said. He'd done this, that, and a number of things. But he alone knew how little it had all amounted to. He puffed on his cigarette and said he wished he'd done things differently. In what way differently, I asked. He took another puff and said he would have married later, maybe traveled more, then gone after things that were hard to achieve, like trying to build a business on the side, and not always be putting things off till later. Watching him smoke and regret his past, I thought, yes, all those things you put off vanished into thin air like smoke escaping from a chimney. What did this man suffer from? Life. Why did he smoke? Life. Life is the impetus for the ingestion of most mind-numbing agents. In life, each of us desires lasting happiness, yet each of us knows lasting happiness is impossible. The resultant unhappiness, anxiety, pain, or insomnia varies in intensity in any given person on any given day, but for centuries people have been stupefying themselves with alcohol or drugs to escape some version of the contradiction. Often the contradiction expresses itself as a kind of discord that people feel between their lives and their conscience, between how they live and how they think they should be living. The exact nature of the discord doesn't really matter. All that matters is that for one reason or another, they are plagued by an inner voice telling them that their lives are wrong in some way. And because they cannot silence life, they silence their conscience by dulling their minds to varying degrees, or at least by giving themselves a calm, pleasant sensation using mind-altering drugs. As I noted earlier, thanks to industry, the drugs we use today are safer and more precise than before. The drugs include psychoactive medication, but also the old drugs, such as alcohol and tobacco, as well as new products like e-cigarettes. The question becomes, why does a public health establishment hate e-cigarettes in particular? Animosity toward tobacco and heavy alcohol use is understandable, since they're unhealthy, but vaping has not yet been proven so. Some argue it is because the free market invented vaping, and without public health input. Public health dislikes drugs invented without its input. It also dislikes the free market. Yet antidepressants and anti-anxiety agents were invented by the free market, and without public health input. The public health establishment has no problem with them. Indeed, in public health, the treatment of negative feelings with prescription psychoactive medication figures prominently in its portfolio. To understand public health's animosity toward vaping, one has to look closer at its ideologies. I talked to a public health expert about my friend at the party. The expert said my friend needed to be educated about the dangers of tobacco. I told him my friend was a doctor, like me. The expert said a doctor should know better. I said the doctor did, but he couldn't stop smoking. He was unhappy, and smoking made him feel better. The expert asked me why he was unhappy. The usual, I said. He hates himself, his kids hate him, and he fights with his spouse over money. The expert asked, is he eating right? Has he joined a gym? Has he tried meditation? I said I didn't know. Maybe he needs to be on an antidepressant, the expert said. Herein lies the origin of public health's animosity toward vaping. One public health ideology designed to target everyday unhappiness involves wellness and lifestyle. For example, good diet, meditation, and exercise. These simple remedies are portrayed as a reliable solution to the bad feelings that arise from life's disappointments, with the added benefit of being good for one's health. But in truth, they often fall short in their psychological purpose. Indeed, how many times have I seen people leave a wellness center in my neighborhood, and before they're even in their cars, life has already swamped them with stress and strain. They scream at their spouse or at their client on a cell phone. They rush to open their car doors not to be late for the next appointment. Public health's wellness and lifestyle ideology taps into people's hope for a quick and sure route to happiness, and a healthy one at that, one that does not require a fundamental change in how they live, and which bypasses medication. Sadly, there is no such route. On the other end of public health's treatment spectrum for everyday unhappiness lies the ideology of psychoactive medication. Here, contentment is found not in diet or yoga, but in powerful mind-altering drugs that stifle the conscience and make people feel happier, independent of how their lives are actually going. Over the last 30 years, public health has allied itself with medical science to medicalize everyday unhappiness and to blame unhappiness on neurotransmitters rather than life. I noted earlier how the word neurotransmitters like the words wellness and lifestyle has become a major ideological catchword that symbolizes a popular desire to enjoy a respectable and enduring happiness without much effort. The public health expert said my friend needed to be on a drug. My friend's problem, according to the expert, was that he was on the wrong drug. He was on tobacco when he should have been on an antidepressant. Public health experts make similar recommendations when advising people suffering from opioid addiction. As you know, many Americans today are hooked on opioids. It's a real crisis. Many of these people live in Trump country. They lost their jobs in manufacturing, they lost their houses, they lost their self-esteem, and they spiraled down into opioid addiction. But what public health experts often tell these people is that opioids are not the solution. If you lost your job and you feel low self-esteem, you should be on an antidepressant, not an opioid, they say. If you're anxious because you can't pay your mortgage, you should be on an anti-anxiety agent, not an opioid, they say. If you can't sleep at night because you can't find work, you should be on a sleeping pill, not an opioid, they say. Public health experts encourage unhappy people facing difficult life situations to stupefy themselves with powerful mind-altering medications, and they legitimize that stupefaction through appeals to science. They convince people that a drug-induced happy state, which often lasts all day, is respectable because their unhappiness arose from an imbalance of neurotransmitters in the first place. But public health demands this proceed in accordance with its ideology and its medications. That is, not with opioids or tobacco, but rather with antidepressants and anti-anxiety agents. Sitting between public health's emphasis on wellness and its generous support for psychoactive medication is life. Plain old life, with all its troubles and disappointments, where people try to get through the day as best they can, with no expectation that a magic activity will fix their unhappiness, and no belief that a prescription drug is justifiable. And this is why public health hates vaping. For vaping, along with alcohol and cigarettes, testifies to the fact that there exists a realm where public health cannot penetrate, where public health is not believed, where public health has no real power, and where ideology falls flat and people see it for what it is. In this realm, ancient custom supplies solutions to people, typically in the form of a little pleasant mind-numbing from time to time, not all day, but for 20 minutes here or there, nothing immoral, but nothing moral, nothing that carries the imprimatur of science, but that is nevertheless tried and true, a drink from time to time, maybe a smoke here and there, a short quick buzz to stifle one's conscience. Here, public health can do little. It can encourage people to avoid tobacco and heavy drinking, and it stands on firm ground while doing so, since these are unhealthy. But it cannot do the same with vaping or light drinking, because these have not been proven unhealthy. And since public health avoids attacking light drinking for political reasons, it focuses all its ire on vaping. Vaping threatens public health at its weakest point, ideology. It testifies to the fact that some aspects of life cannot be stabilized, that hope and aspiration are futile, and for science to claim otherwise is irrelevant, even deceitful. Besides helping people quit smoking, vaping has this other purpose of making everyday life a little more agreeable. And this undercuts some of the rationale for public health's expansion beyond its original portfolio of infectious disease, sanitation, and quarantines. For public health ventured into the everyday spheres of life thinking it could establish some permanent equilibrium, for example, in the areas of unhappiness, poverty, injustice, or violence, by combining good intentions with a scientific method. But it cannot succeed at this, and for the same reason it is easier to write 10 volumes of philosophy than it is to put one principle into practice. Life is too complicated. In much of life, we are obliged to find our way through an unmapped maze, and the best that many people can hope for is to find moments of rest and relief beneath fragile shelters. The scientific method is as powerless to guide the public health experts in the realm of life as reason is to guide the diplomat, the general, or the CEO. Indeed, turning the problem of everyday unhappiness over to public health experts trained in the scientific method is no better than turning world government over to a federation of lawyers. The idea may be excellent, but it's impossible to carry out. And for this reason, public health both hates vaping and fears it, because vaping represents the voice of reality. I speak of vaping here not as a form of harm reduction, but as something that will one day become ubiquitous and sit alongside social drinking as one more light, stupefying agent to ease people's everyday tensions. I believe this is vaping's future. For now, both for political and public relations reasons, it is best for the vaping community to focus on harm reduction. Doing so is not a deception. In this area, vaping is life-saving. Vaping helps people stop smoking. It may not be completely benign, but is safer than tobacco. But thinking more broadly, people will never stop comparing how they live with how they think they should be living. They will never accept their unhappiness as a product of unavoidable circumstances, and they will never stop wishing for their unhappiness to go away. In short, whether you consider them to be acting for good reasons or bad, unhappy people will never stop wanting to stupefy themselves. In the future, when adults ask themselves while thinking about life, is this really everything, or is there something else? Can this be everything? Can this, the life we live, and nothing more, be the reward of all our struggles and energies? And when they conclude, yes, this is everything, they will likely reach for an electronic cigarette in the same way people today reach for a beer. Not out of an ideology, but simply because life is difficult enough as it is, and so want to enjoy a moment of calm in an age-old manner. Thank you.